So I find it a bit interesting to talk at these kind of events these days, to be honest with you. Because do you remember that chapter of the economy when if you would say that you were into impact or sustainability, people would react like, oh, sustainability? Sure. Here's the kids table. Right? If you can't read the menu, just call us. We're the big guys. There was that chapter in our economy. And luckily, this is a very new one, if we look around us, right? We have managed to establish this conversation about impact and purpose, but the reality is when we establish a conversation that we need to start answering questions. And some questions are easier than others to answer. For example, what is the purpose of our organization? A lot of our organizations here are answering this question today. But there are other questions right behind the corner. Like, what is our purpose? Of all the topics, all the causes that we know in the world, of all the things that we know are important, what has our name on it? And when we look at the things that are happening in the world right now, the things that we are doing to each other, the people behind them, the people in power, are they fulfilling their purpose? As I said, some questions around these topics are easier than others to answer. And a big part of me would love to ditch this talk and just have a conversation with you about it and ask you so many questions. What brings you here? Why are you here? What for? But I sort of took a commitment. So maybe we can do that later, and I start with what I was invited for. I was invited here to tell you about my pretty unconventional line of work with founders, activists, investors, family offices, around the topic of power, and in specific, its relationship to purpose and pain. And I could tell you about it intellectually. There is so much to talk about this, but the reality is that as you're going to discover in this keynote, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I would rather tell you about tools that we can use to do primarily three things. One, learn about what I call the power traps that we fall into. Second, how to avoid them. And third, how you can work through them or around them in a way that regenerates everything and everyone involved. Does it sound good? Cool, so that's what I'm gonna do. And so like any other conversation, I'd love to start with introductions. My full name is Margherita Pagani. I'm Italian. But after 10 years abroad, and having seen my name written in any possible way, Portugal, you're guilty of this as well. Please call me Meg. And when it comes to the kind of things that it would make sense for me to share with you about my background, to have this conversation with you today, some people would tell me that it's important to mention that I'm a Forbes 30 under 30, Fortune 40 under 40 founder, that between the age of 24 and 31, I have set up multiple impact ventures that operated in 4 continents, or other people would tell me, look, for the things that you want to talk about, it's important you mention that I, like most women on the planet, survived rape and domestic violence, and that what saved my life, amongst anything other things, was sport. I, in fact, became a professional volleyball player. I played for 12 years. But we know by now that none of this matters, right? We came at that moment in the history of our civilization where we finally are coming to the reckoning moment, where we know that no amount of achievements or success or background stories are more valuable than the ability to answer one question. Why are we here? Why are we actually here? And what for? And so if we were, considering the brain power in the room, if we were to ask this question to everybody here and to any other event of this impact and climate sector, we would pretty much land on these 3 points everywhere. We're here because it's urgent to find solutions and save our planet. And this is where my keynote takes a harder turn. This is also where I need to apologize to the Ethical Assembly team, because they did ask me what I would talk about. But what I'm gonna share, it's probably going to be in a bit of a contrast with most of the point in the agenda of this event, and probably most of the things that have been said or will be said on this stage later. Because I understand the logic and these 3 points, but I don't agree with any of them. I don't agree with any of them because I understand where they come from. I understand why we framed the narratives of this sector around this. But if what we care about is action, being effective, make meaningful change, These 3 points represent one of the worst traps that we can possibly fall into when it comes to make anything meaningful happen. So I understand where they come from, but I don't agree with any of them. Why? Well, let's talk about power traps, shall we? So if we want to talk about action, the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is our playing field, right? So what's our playing field? If we look around, we would say that our playing field is what today we call the sector of impact, climate justice, or purpose, right? Well, is it though? By raise of hands, how many of you know someone in this sector that has experienced or is experiencing burnout, depression, or eco-anxiety? Pretty much everybody. How many of you know projects or teams that were doing incredible work, but they broke down because of conflict in the team or governance issue? By raise of hands. Still pretty much at least half of the room. Last but not least, how many of you know people that are very purpose-driven, they have a clear meaning about their life, but for some reason, they hold some resistance or conflict around money? Most of the room. What is our playing field, people? Because we like to think that it's about impact and purpose, but more than 50% of the projects and the initiatives in these industries fall apart because of conflicts about power and money. And in fact, if you think about it, even the words purpose and impact, they don't mean anything on their own. They're neutral. In the history of humanity, we have done the worst things, the most horrific things to each other with a very clear purpose. Actually, the people that did that were convinced to be doing something good. They had an impact strategy and they had very clear KPIs. So while we think that our playing field is in a good direction because we have a purpose statement, an impact strategy, or KPIs, I'm sorry, but that's not enough. That is not our playing field. And it's not a security to be heading in a good direction. So what is our playing field, right? When I talk about this, I like to use a symbol that I love very much. So I studied fine art, and I love symbols. This one is a symbol that comes from an artist, an Italian artist, Pistoletto from Torino, that uses this symbol for incredible installations around the world. He calls it the third paradise. And I love it because it's perfect to talk about the two elements that define our true playing field, which is our body and our mind. How so? So on our body side, we have what we call somatic states, both in terms of our structure and whether our structure allows or not specific functions to happen in our body. This is where we find everything from the state of our nervous system to whether we are electromagnetically grounded enough to function properly, epigenetics, nutrition, etc., etc. On the other side, we find the cognitive state. So the kind of narratives that we choose to read reality and the behaviors that we develop consequently in response to those chosen narratives. These two elements define whether our playing field is healthy, it goes in a good direction for the kind of things we want to do, or unhealthy if it closes up. And that's when we think we're doing good stuff and we aren't. How so? So if we look back at the 3 points that we talked about earlier, the first one was urgency, right? It's urgent. When we keep framing things from a place of urgency, what we do is that both cognitively and somatically, we reinforce what in psychology we call activated states. Those states are reactive, not creative. When we are in those states, we don't see options. We cannot think creatively, we cannot think bravely, the kind of ideas or projects that we actually need to shift our economy. In those states, the only thing we do is that we perceive the tension and we propagate it. We end up, mostly unconsciously, abusing power, either on others, or those of us that don't do that, on ourselves. Because that is also abuse of power, isn't it? And we internalize that tension. Or if we think about the second point, problems and solutions, that is a very peculiar way to look at reality. And when we do that, we fall into what psychology calls the triangle of drama. We frame things cognitively in terms of there is a villain or a tragedy, there are victims of it, and someone has to be the hero. The problem is that when we unconsciously find ourselves identified with that role of hero, and this is not my first rodeo, I've worked with enough entrepreneurs and activists that I know we all have it. We attach our identity to it. And what our subconscious mind will do is that unconsciously we will make sure to either perpetuate the problem or create new ones. Because we need them. Our identity depends on it. And lastly, when we talk about saving the planet, what do we do when we feel eco-anxious or in anxiety for the kind of things we care about in the world? We tend to calm down. We try to find ways to numb or regulate our nervous system, most of the time in ways that are unhealthy. Some people eat or drink to try to calm down. Most of us don't do that. Most of us nowadays look for more information, don't we? We go more online. We, instead of binging food, we binge information so we feel a sense of control of what's going on. Well, what that does on the side of obviously feeding off the cognitive traps, we spend more time online. More information feeds the activated state of feeling overwhelmed, but especially most of our technology today, amongst other features, is all based on blue light, our screens. What blue light does is that it gets our mitochondria crazy. The mitochondria in our body are the ones responsible for how energy circulates in our body. When they stop functioning properly, the first thing that we lose is in our cells what is called the rate of repair. Once we lose the rate of repair, that's when our cells start to get sick and we develop different kinds of sicknesses, including cancer. So even the way we deal with eco-anxiety is a trap that we cannot afford to fall into. So what do we do about this? Because all of these things I'm not telling them because you shouldn't have them. It's absolutely normal that we have this. In fact, and we're not going to get into the details of this because I think I don't have the time, there are incredible incentives and interest for these kind of traps to be there, for us to be in these states. We're very monetizable when we are in these states. But if it's true that we care about our role to play, and I do believe it's true, I do believe that that's what we have at heart, even when unconsciously we fall into any of this, then we need to make a decision. Do we want to have understandable reactions or to be right? Or do we want to become effective and apply some of this to the kind of things that we want to do? And how do we do that? So I hit a big wall about this in 2019. I was at what many would suggest to be the top of my career, awards, international projects, but it sort of dawned on me that most of the things that I was doing in a sector I identified with were feeding the same system I was trying to change. It was feeding off me, of all my reactions, of all the things I was thinking I was right to do. And so I knew that I needed other languages and tools. And that's where I eventually landed on what I today call the other ways of knowing. What are the other ways of knowing? In my case, it's two things. On one side is my family story. My father was a theologian and a psychologist, and he also brought to Italy in the late 70s the Silva method. It's becoming more known today, funnily enough. And my mom is an end-of-life nurse. This means that I grew up with things like cognitive science or mindfulness or spirituality or end-of-life practices every day. It was part of our conversations. And then in the last decade, I personally chose to start spending time and practicing with ancestral traditions and indigenous communities, especially indigenous leaders in the Amazon rainforest. I call them the old and the new sciences. And it's at the intersection of the two that I finally found the kind of language and tools that allowed me to start seeing doors where before I could only see walls. And there are two main doors that really struck me, that came out of my own practice, that I really would love to share with you today before talking about tools. The first one is that I soon understood through my own practice that when we say that's wrong, what we mean is hurtful. Whatever it is that we feel it's really wrong in the world, what we actually mean is that it's hurtful. That we see pain in the world, and normally it's in very specific things or causes or fronts, is because we know pain. Because we have our own trauma, because we have our own toxicity of those same systems within us. And that is both a good and a bad news. It's a bad news, obviously, because we have those toxicity within us, and pain is information, but it cannot be our soil. because it makes us reactive, as we said before. But it's a good news because we can only rewrite the stories we carry. We can only make something about anything when we feel it's wrong, when we know it, for reasons that sometimes we cannot explain. And when we start to work through this, in which other way we can relate to pain, because people use power depending on their relationship to pain, then we find a second door, which has to do with the fact that we still might find ourselves more regulated, more grounded, more clear, and still caring about pretty big things. And it can be scary. It can be overwhelming. It can become even harder to get that alignment every day. And that's when it's important to remember something that I learned with one of the main leaders that I speak with and that I practice with from Indigenous communities, which is we can never control what will happen, but we can control the state we are in when that happens. In which state will that find us changes everything. That is in our agency, nothing else is. So what do we do about this? I spent the last 3 to 5 years not only practicing directly, but also trying to translate these principles into tools, into actionable things that we could use and apply in our projects and in our lives. I call that today the ecology of pain, power, and purpose. Basically, tools that I use today with founders, activists, investors, both one-on-one and in programs, on fronts like governance or power dynamics or teams or relationship to wealth and privilege. Tools that allow us to acquire different lenses on how to navigate this and therefore make doors where others see only walls. And I really thought about what would be the best tool to share with you today, knowing the kind of caring, deeply caring crowd that normally shows up at these kind of events. And I landed on a tool that I use with absolutely everybody. Every single student, every single client that I work with goes through this. The nerds in the room, if you have a journal, this is your moment. I call it a tree map. Literally, if you have something to write with, this tool can go with you, you can use it anywhere. It can be used in many ways, even beyond what we normally imagine. So for those of you that do want to write, I would love you to sketch quickly a tree. A tree with roots, with a trunk, and with branches. And on root level, I'd love you to write down everything that you intake. Think in terms of both tangibles and intangibles. So on one side, the somatic intake, what you consume, so food, drinks, substances, whether you need to be medicated, or anything else that you intake. And on the other side, what we intake cognitively. What kind of content do you consume? What kind of music do you listen to? What kind of cultures are you exposed to every day? What stories are there for you to analyze? I would love you to map this out. The second thing that I'd love you to map out is on trunk level. I would love you to write down the names of the 10 to 15 people that you interact the most with, both online and in person. Because maybe in person you see 1, 2, 3 people every day, maybe not even. But who are the people that you interact with the most online actually shape your space way more than you imagine, even those that you don't know directly. Influencers, thought leaders that maybe you listen to every day. Who are those people? Because if somatically and cognitively we have a playing field that is defined there, the people we interact the most with define our roof. What's possible and impossible, what we feel supported for and what we're not supported for. What we feel that would cost us our belonging if we would dare to say it or dare to do it. It's all defined by the trunk level. And then finally, on branch level. I'd love you to write there everything that you feel with your creative energy. So think your projects, your companies, but also if you have children, they go there. If you are refurbishing your apartment, that goes there. You're being creative about it. And including the projects that maybe you did and you're not doing them anymore, but you haven't grieved them yet. You haven't accepted yet that that is not happening. Our culture doesn't deal well with it and it's still in your system. Or the ideas that you really want to do in the future, you're not doing them yet, but they're already there, they're taking up RAM with their tab open. Thank you, the nerds in the room. And then I would love you to step back and look at that tree for a second. Because the main thing, really, the main thing that I learned practicing with ancestral communities is that we all know somewhere within us that we're just the life expressing itself, having a human experience, instead of a bird experience or a flower experience or whatever else experience. But just like the flower or the bird, the gifts that we have are not ours. There is an entire ecosystem that is waiting for us to properly bloom and properly offer what is never ours to just keep. And what language does life have for us to remember that or to try to find what's out of tune? Whatever on your tree feels off. Whatever on your tree, you know, for how much you can love it or find it delicious or whatever, you know, it doesn't have your name on it. It doesn't give you more energy when you're exposed to it. Not anymore, maybe it did. But maybe your identity is attached to it, or your habits are depending on it. And with these three, exactly like I do, you can go to different specialists. You can do your own exercises to figure out your uniqueness, your blueprint of pain, power, and purpose, as I call it. What is it telling you? The language is yours only. And life always knows something we don't know. And the beauty is that when we start to get acquainted with learning what I call the science, the art, and the skill of empowered or disempowered states, this in tune or out of tune, that's when we discover something that I found very important for me, that the opposite of pain or hurt isn't healed. It's medicine. It's when we figure out what kind of information there is in our own pain and struggles that we can turn into something that we can prevent from happening in the world. And the opposite of rage and anger is not calm. It's creativity. It's what can we create that we always wish existed. And so to conclude, of everything we talked about, if there are three things that I would love you to walk away with, it would be these ones. The first one is, we cannot control what will happen, but we can choose what state we're in when it does happen. Because the reality is that we're not afraid of challenges. I don't believe that for a second. You wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. What we are afraid of is to lose our chance to do what is actually ours to do. What has our name on it. To lose that opportunity for distractions or because we're too revitalized to take care of it. And finally, to keep asking the question, why am I here? Why are we here? What for? And when those questions become too scary or too overwhelming, I would love you to remember one thing, that we were made for these times. That life knows something that we don't know, and that you were made for these times. And to trust that. Thank you very much.